Great, thanks, Esmeralda. Well, we're delighted today to have Berk Ozler here visiting CCPR. Berk is a lead economist at the World Bank. He received his Ph.D. in economics from Cornell in 2001, and he has a wide variety of work, I think, of interest to members of our center. His work is focused on poverty and inequality, the role of cash transfers in mitigating HIV risk in Malawi. And he's also done a lot of really exciting cluster randomized field experiments. In case you haven't read the development impact blog, you should check it out. That's something to which he regularly contributes, and I understand he's also a founder of that. So there's all sorts of really interesting things there for those of you who may be interested. His current work focuses on ways to reduce unintended pregnancies, which is really closely aligned with some of my research interests, including a current trial in Cameroon, which we'll be hearing about today. So let me go ahead and turn it over to you, Berk. You can take it away.
Great, thank you so much. Thanks really for inviting me. It's been, and also organizing all the meetings. It's been really wonderful to see some old faces, some new people that I met today. It's been a really nice set of meetings. I'm also looking forward to meeting the grad students afterwards in the half hour afterwards. I was told that you tend to be a quiet crowd and maybe a little bit shy to ask questions. So I'm going to pause kind of like somewhat regularly to see if people have questions. But if there is something in between the pauses that is more urgent, just raise your hand. And if I don't see it, I'm sure Martha and Esme will see it. And then they can just interrupt me. That's fine. And then there should still hopefully be some time to at the end for more general Q&A. But I'm used to being interrupted generally. Okay, so let's see. And if Natalie was telling me this morning that like how nice it is that I'm presenting this again, because I presented this just before the pandemic hit, and I think it was somewhere around September, October 2019. And back then this project was just starting and we were developing some of the early study protocols and things like that. So we did actually say, oh, I'll hopefully come back and present some results. And today is actually that. So it's nice that like you sometimes say that, but doesn't happen. So it's nice that it's happening now. So for some of you, this will be a little bit of a repetition. If you were there 2.5 years ago, apologies, but I can't really assume everybody has the motivation. So we'll just go through that quickly. The thing that motivated me to go into this like about 5 years ago is that this is one of those things, is just kind of like John Oliver says, like, how is this still a thing? You know, like nearly half of pregnancies worldwide are considered unwanted or mistimed. And this is not just a developing country problem. The share is pretty similar in the United States. Unintended pregnancies, a major contributor to high maternal mortality rates. And where I'm working, this is a big problem because maternal mortality ratios are very high in Cameroon, above 500 per 100,000 live births. And that's, to give you a sense, kind of like an order of magnitude higher than places like Vietnam and Brazil, and 2 orders of magnitude larger than places like Netherlands. And of course, in addition to kind of like the reduction in women's welfare, the low age at first birth and short intervals of between pregnancies are associated with all sorts of like negative things, both for the mother and the child. Now, the reason I say like, how is this still a thing, is because it's not like the technology isn't there, right? So we actually have both long-acting and short-active contraceptives that are, some of them are very, very effective. Like you practically can't get pregnant if you're using them. There's no typical use effectiveness issues, or failure rates are like minuscule. But people don't use them. And again, this is not just a developing country problem. I, for example, was looking at from Martha's work, and then I jumped into Upstream, who's doing work in an NGO doing work in Delaware in the United States. And the kind of like women 15 to 49 using long-acting methods in the United States has gone from low single digits in the early 2000s to barely 15% by like 2018 or something like that. So we're still talking very low numbers here of take-up. And there are a bunch of reasons for that. Big one is side effects, but there are also lots of other things on the demand side. There's a lot of misinformation, fears, confusion. There is discretion issues because partners or parents, etc., might be opposed to you using contraceptives. And then on the supply side, you have each country has different issues. US has its own, but where I am in Cameroon, stockouts are common. Health providers are really not trained to administer a lot of these, like they don't know how to talk about side effects. And then there are also significant biases, like they'll be less likely to talk about certain methods with certain types of clientele, which really hurts counseling effectively. So we did some formative qualitative work back in 2017, 2018. So I talked about that in much more detail back when I talked at your center a few years ago. I'm going to summarize here, like the biggest things that we saw were that the providers just didn't feel comfortable doing any of this stuff because this is not stuff you'll actually learn in nursing school. You'll learn it like on the job afterwards. And that tends to be very haphazard. So as a result, they didn't know how to talk to people about side effects and their management. And this is actually quite a deep and complex topic. Even people with a PhD, I think it's hard to convey probability distributions to lay people and then talk about idiosyncratic side effects that what your sister is experiencing with a method may be completely different than what you're experiencing. So those are difficult. And then there's these bias and cost. The cost one is interesting because United States and Cameroon are actually lonely in this field of kind of like in the minority, so to speak, where cost in the family planning field is an issue. A lot of countries make these things completely free. We'll see in a second that actually that may not exactly be necessary. In our experiment, we'll show some evidence, but nonetheless, cost is very salient for low-income people, both in the United States and in a place like Cameroon, because these things are not cheap. So what we've done, we've developed a tablet-based counseling app. And this app does three things. One is that it's a job support tool for providers. So our providers in our case are nurse counselors, so to speak. So they essentially use this tool to just kind of like, it's a structure, it gives structure to the counseling session, guides them through kind of something like a survey, essentially, so that they hit all the important points to elicit various kind of like information and preferences to be able to help this person the best. So that's kind of like the one aspect of it. It's a job support tool. And in that, it's actually not alone. There are other apps like this in the market. They're usually not targeted to the providers, mainly because in the United States, providers don't feel like they want a job support tool to interfere with their work. They feel like they're more than capable of doing it themselves. But there are versions of this where it's an online app. So you could be actually taking kind of like using this tool online before you go to your OBGYN, and then you take a printout of the recommendations or something like that. There are versions of this that are kind of like waiting room apps as well on a tablet. So when you're waiting at your doctor's office, you can do it. And then when you go in, you can talk to them about it. It saves a bit of time. But ours is the only one I know that's actually for, nurses to use while they're counseling people. But, it just, we don't really claim any novelty here. It's just something that works for us. And as I'm going to tell you now, like it serves two other very important purposes for our work. Yes, it's a job support tool. The nurses love it. It's very usable and the clients really like it. But also it's actually a tool through which we can deliver randomized interventions at the individual client level. And I'm going to talk about those in a second. And then also the entire counseling session then is recorded, not in an audio sense, although if you wanted to do it and you had the IRB to do it, you could do audio and then transcribe those as well. But every question, we know the answers to everything. So we know all the demographics, all the client preferences, birth history, etc., all that stuff, and then what they adopt in the end. Right? So it serves those three purposes, and it's going to be important for us. By the way, this is, if anybody wants to use this, like just contact me. There's no kind of like possessiveness here. Like, we're happy to share it with anyone. You can adapt it to your context. You can translate it. It's all good. And then what we're going to do is we're going to deliver two interventions through this app. One of them is about cost. We're going to give randomized discounts for the methods that are available at this hospital. And the second one is we're going to introduce an alternative counseling regime. And we're going to test those two things. And some of the papers that I cite here, along with other research, suggest that these are also the two main salient issues in a market like the United States. Like, as clients in clinics where they don't have health insurance are very credit constrained, so price is a big thing for them. But then also there are a lot of OBGYNs in the United States who are not really trained in a lot of this new stuff, right? So counseling and price are two salient features for, if you're a US person or a developing country person, they are important. I'm going to skip the lit review here, but except to mention that, I'll show you that we actually, in this pilot phase of this experiment that I'm talking about today, we did actually have a little arm where we essentially distinguished free provision from very small price for the provision, because there is a substantive literature on kind of like health products, whether it's deworming pills or bed nets and things like that, that have shown that take-up can plummet going from 0 to epsilon prices. For both statistical power reasons, we didn't have enough power to distinguish, but also we actually didn't see a whole lot of it. We kind of abandoned that line of research after the pilot. But these kind of experiments didn't exist for family planning, and we were curious, but in our study population, whether it's 25 cents or 0 doesn't seem to make much of a difference, but I can't say that very confidently. But so I'm going to ignore that bit of it today. So I'm going to talk a little bit now about the setting, like in Cameroon, and who is eligible and who's not. But before I go to that, why don't we see if there are any questions, clarifying or otherwise, at this stage? Waiting. Okay, I'll continue. Yeah, feel free to raise your hand if things come up. So Martha kindly mentioned that most of my work in experiments is cluster randomized trials, and that's true. So normally I'm trying to oversee field work that's in 180 villages, that are all around the country, in a place like Malawi or something like that, and that's quite difficult. This is the exact opposite of that. So we are in one hospital in Yaoundé. It's a big public hospital. It's about maybe 4,000 deliveries in a year. So about maybe 10 a day or something like that. And it's certainly the busiest women and children's hospital in Yaoundé. And what we noticed was happening in this place is that they have a dedicated family planning unit, right? So and then people walk in and then seek services, family planning services at this place. But it had only 2 nurses and they were very busy. And so when people from other parts of the hospital needed counseling, which was rare, no other nurse could do it. So they had to call down these people, and they, if they could find time from their busy schedule, they would go up to the neonatology or maternity or whatever and counsel someone. And then, if they decided to adopt something, then they would have to go to another department and get it administered there, whatever. So there's a big leaky bucket problem here. And I think this will go to kind of any of you who want to raise external validity concerns, etc. It's true that now, I'm actually going to be talking about a population that walks into a hospital, right? So I'm not going to be talking about, effects of campaigns to get people into the hospital and then get them counseled and what would have happened there. So it is a special kind of, population in that sense. These are women who are just giving birth, or like they may have had a gynecological problem or an abortion. They may be there for postnatal or antenatal visits. They may be getting vaccinations for their kids. But they're all seeking some maternal health or child health or women's health related thing. So they're special, but it's a very big group. There are lots of women who go to clinics all the time. And our impression from this setting was that a lot of them do need or could use family planning counseling. A lot of them aren't using a method. And they could actually be, if you simply ask them, they say, oh, yes, I would like to be counseled. And then a lot of them actually do adopt methods. So essentially, we aim to kind of make this almost like a checklist thing where, like in all those departments now, this hospital is asking people, hey, by the way, are you using anything? Would you like a free counseling session, etc. I see a hand up. Anne?
Hi, Berk.
Hi.
What do you know about, I mean, your cautions are, and your defense is very reasonable, but what do you know about from other sources or this source about selection into going to the hospital? I mean, because,
I'll show you
even in Yaoundé, it's a problem.
I'll show you the characteristics of this population compared to like a demographic health survey in Yaoundé in a second.
Okay.
Yeah, but yes, I don't know anything about unobservable selection, but I will be able to show you observable characteristics.
Okay.
They're quite different.
Yeah, I'm sure. Thanks.
Yeah, you're welcome. Okay, so the eligibility criteria in our setting is that, so essentially what we've done is, we decided that we couldn't, of course, ask these people to say, hey, do you want to be counseled? But then we don't have anybody to counsel them. So what our collaborators, the co-PIs, which include kind of professor of OBGYN at this hospital and head of research, they've essentially designed the kind of latest state-of-the-art like training, like 1-week training module for the entire nursing staff at the hospital. And then they essentially all did their training. And then they did their training with the tablet-based app. And then the new ones followed the old ones around, tagging along in counseling sessions and administering and practicing on dummies and, like real human beings, etc. Doing this stuff. So now we have 9 trained counselors in all of these departments. And, they're essentially instructed to just kind of like, whenever somebody is there in their care, they just kind of ask them, hey, by the way, do you want a free family planning counseling? And then, so our eligible sample is out of those people who said yes, who are 15 to 49 years old, and, received, counseling during our pilot phase. And we exclude about the 5% or so people in our sample who said they want to wait less than 12 months before becoming pregnant again. Right? So it's essentially, and the reason for that is that our final outcome that we're interested in is 12-month pregnancy rates. And we want to be able to say that those were unintended, even though there can be ambivalence, of course. But, so our eligible population all have said they want to wait at least 12 months, if not longer. And then, as you'll see, actually, a third of our sample said like they want no more children. So I tried to hit client characteristics, and instead I just exited. So let me just go back here for a second and go back. There we go. All right. So, and so this is to your question. Our average person is about almost 30 years old, and we have very few adolescents, despite the fact that this whole research agenda was motivated by adolescents, and about 10%. And here I have the full sample, and then here I have by department. And when I say department, it's not about the department of the nurse, it's about the origin of this patient. Right? So either this patient actually showed up at the family planning unit seeking family planning services, or they were somewhere else and they were approached. And those are also different populations, as you will see, right? We have about a third each of single, cohabiting, or married population. You can see how much more educated our population is. A third, 42% of them have some tertiary education compared to 21% in Yaoundé, so it's double. interestingly, it's not so much the difference is not about like a lot of uneducated people. It's actually the differences in really secondary education. Like in Yaoundé, there's a lot of, people in the DHS who just had secondary education. In our sample, not a whole lot. And then you can see that like our sample is much more, they've had about 4 pregnancies, 2.7 kids alive, ever gave birth almost 100%. And then more than 50% of them have given birth in the last 3 months. And there's an obvious reason for that. They're mostly coming from this, like these are people who just given birth, or maybe they've given birth a week or 2 ago and they're there for their first checkup and things like that. So 84% of the people who are from other departments have given birth in the last 3 months, compared with only 34% who showed up at the FP unit. And you can see that like in the DHS, that percentage is 5, right? So that's very different. So let me move you guys back to where you were so that I can see at least a few faces. All right, so this is Ashkopi. It's a big hospital, like I said, in the capital of Cameroon. From the outside, it looks nice and peaceful, but it's kind of crazy inside. We spent a lot of time there in the counseling room and the maternity ward. So now the interventions. I don't want people to think that this is some like idea that I concocted and then I just went and created it. So this is a very big multidisciplinary working group that we're working with, comprised of nurses, including the nurses from the hospital, the head nurse and others, doctors, OBGYNs, public health experts, as well as kind of behavioral economists and economists working together. There were a series of workshops identifying issues, and there were other working groups working on different things. Like we were more on this kind of tech app side, but there are other things going on in Cameroon in this field. And essentially, we've developed an app together that we try to kind of mimic the, kind of like incorporate the best practices for counseling used around the world and to ensure a high quality service. So in a way, if you think about, let's say, kind of like a quality of service delivery and FP checklist, like that's validated by the Pub Council or something like that, it's almost impossible if a nurse uses our app and follows the protocols that all of those checklists, each item will not be hit. Like, so by definition, you have to have almost 100% success if you use the app and follow it, right? And of course, that doesn't mean that it's necessarily high quality service. People can still be dissatisfied, or the nurses can be pushy or whatever. So that's where training comes in. But this is not a replacement for the provider. It's a job aid for the provider. There are a lot of things about family planning counseling that are difficult to talk about. For example, thinking about contraindications for certain medical conditions or side effects and things like that. So it's good not to have to consult huge tomes of books all the time, but the app do that work for you. It actually streamlines things nicely and effectively, and the clients quite enjoy actually the technology aspect of it. And I'm going to go into detail as to what interventions we're delivering now, because I think they're important, and we actually depart a little bit from status quo, which is the entire point. But in a nutshell, it has two sections, so to speak. It's like, think of it like a survey. And the first section is where we welcome the client, assure them that this is all confidential, private, friendly environment. And, they're just going to talk about kind of like their life plans and dreams and what they want to do, and how all of this family planning stuff fits into there. And then we get some, basic demographic information, birth history, family planning history. Then we actually elicit whether they have a particular method in mind or not. Then we talk about side effects, and the talk about side effects is both meant to be educational as well as eliciting strong preferences about avoiding certain types of side effects, such as, let's say, heavy bleeding or amenorrhea or weight gain and things like that. And then we actually do a medical history so that we can know about contraindications. That's the needs assessment bit. And at that point, what happens is that the app actually does an internal ranking itself of methods that might be suitable for this client. And it goes from like 1 to 4 because there's only 4 methods available at this hospital or in this environment period. And the interventions are about whether that's revealed or not. So, and the counseling interventions, and then we have a price intervention that crosses with that. So now I'm going to talk about now we're in the method choice section, and what happens in that method choice section, I will just show you. So the first one tries to mimic the status quo approach, which is the historical focus on having people be given neutral information on a range of options, and then allowing them to decide what they would like to pick themselves. The key there is that the counselor is expected to provide little to no guidance, but just be the kind of like the delivery mechanism for neutral information and answering questions. So what happens there is that the tablet at that point looks like this. And then the nurse is supposed to use this like text in black, which I'll paraphrase as essentially saying, look, you know, there might be a few good options for you, but why don't we discuss your options like in this order here, and then you can tell me which one you would like to talk about in more detail. So now this list here that she sees in front of her, what she does is like, you know, this is randomized, and she'll essentially grab cue cards and then put them on the table in that order. And then they will discuss each of those methods for about, you know, 60 to 90 seconds per method. And the reason they can do that is as follows. So these are what cue cards look like. We borrowed them from Pathfinder International, which is an NGO works in family planning. And obviously, a detailed discussion of a method actually takes quite a long time. It could be, I'll talk about it in a second, it take anywhere from like 15, 20 minutes. But here, what we're looking for is that the nurse to be able to effectively summarize the basic information about this method so that the client can say, hey, that piqued my interest. Let's talk about one of these in more detail. So what we've done is we've taken these cue cards, we've laminated them for each method, and then we've actually highlighted in yellow the points that they're supposed to hit in like 60 to 90 seconds, like a couple of pros, couple of cons, and then a couple of like how it works, you know, essentially, right? And then key thing there is that once they've done that and they've spent 5-6 minutes going over these methods, and also lactational amenorrhea if the client is eligible, then the nurse will say to the client, okay, now that we've discussed these, which one of these would you like to hear about in more detail? Say the client says IUD, right? They'll now take the cue card of the IUD in front of them, and there's also a sample of like what it looks like and how it works and etc. That's also on the table. They will now go through in detail. Like I said, it can take anywhere from like 10 to 20 minutes in detail discussing that method, at the end of which the nurse will ask the client, what do you think? Do you want to adopt this method, or do you want to hear about something else? I see the hand, I'll come to you in a second. And essentially, if the client says, oh, this looks great, like I'd like to adopt it, you know, we move on to the price revelation, and then we just conclude the counseling session. The client says, no, I don't like this method, I want to hear about something else. The nurse will ask the client which of the remaining methods, these ones in blue over here, she would like to discuss next. And then so on and so forth until we've had the client choose a method. So let me pause there. And Donald?
Yes, pardon me. In what language is all this being conducted, and is that an issue?
In French and occasionally in English, because Cameroon is a bilingual country, de jure, but de facto it's a French-speaking country. So everybody is very comfortable in French, so that's not an issue. When occasionally we have to have it in English, only 1 or 2 of the nurses can do it because the other one's English isn't that good. And even the ones whose English is good, it can potentially be an issue. But the app has a drop-down button at the top, and you can switch languages. So at least the questions come up in the language of preference of the client. So at least the nurse can read the questions, but the understanding between them in a bilingual country can vary a little bit.
But even uneducated people are fluent in French?
Yes, yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Okay, so that's the one that's supposed to, so we call that individual decision making, and IDM for short. So that's the one that's supposed to mimic the status quo. Now in our alternative version, this is what happens. So the screen will now look like this. And what has happened is that the algorithm has actually revealed the ranking, but it does it in a sequentially. So what the nurse does here is that says to the client, look, we've had a great discussion, like based on all the things that you told me, I think there are multiple methods that will work well for you. But I think this one in particular is the best one that's going to work for you. So do you mind if we start with discussing that method first? And if you don't like it, then we can always go to the next best method for you, right? The client at this point can say no. So for example, if this was the IUD and then she knows a little bit about IUDs and she had like, let's say, fear of jabs or like, cuts on her arm or something like that, she may say, no, the implant is disgusting for me. Like, I don't want it. They can just say that, okay, that's fine. We don't mind. Like, here's the next method, and they could do it then. But if she says, yeah, that's fine, let's discuss the method that you think is best for me. Here, in this case, the example is the pill. They'll take the cue card of the pill in front of them, and they'll do exactly like the people in the IDM did. They'll go through it in great detail, like 10 to 20 minutes. And then at the end, the nurse will ask whether the client likes this method and would like to choose it or would like to hear about something else. If they want to choose it, that's great. If they don't want to choose it, then the next method will be revealed. Here, in this case, on the right, you can see there's the IUD, and then they'll continue on until the client chooses something. Now, those of you who are familiar with the family planning counseling world, you probably noticed the key thing here now is that where this is a departure from the historical focus on kind of like full choice, what people will term sometimes full choice, is that if you agreed as a client to discuss the method that's deemed most suitable for you by our app's algorithm, and if you liked it and you decided to take it, you can then essentially adopt that method immediately and leave the hospital without having heard about any other method. And that's the big difference here, right? Now, I will show evidence later that actually doesn't necessarily happen all that much. On average, like, these people get more detailed information than the other group. But in theory, it's possible that there's a bunch of people who just adopt the first method that they heard about. And it is also possible that those people didn't know necessarily much about the other methods. So it's possible that they'll leave the hospital without having ever heard about the injectable or the pill or implant or whatever it is that they didn't discuss. Okay. And then the third one, this one was kind of straightforward for us, but I realized yesterday that this is an issue for a lot of people because I was presenting to another group who does family planning stuff. And it seems like people struggle with this. There's a group of people who come and they have actually a very strong preference on like what they actually want to adopt. They have a strong intention to adopt a certain method. And we initially wanted to say, look, this is a big group. We don't necessarily want to exclude them from the study. So we were randomizing them into one of these two things and then having them sit through this stuff. And the eye rolls and the size and everything, like, just, it was too much. And it was awkward both for the client and the provider. And there were a lot of complaints. So we essentially said, look, what the app will do for those people is that if that preference is really strong, then they will essentially move to the method choice section immediately, where at the top of the list is the method that they want to listen to. And then only if that's contraindicated somehow, or if the client changes their mind after a detailed discussion of that method, then there'll be a default list of like other things that will show up. So essentially about a half of our group is like that. So for them, we don't have a counseling experiment. we only have a price experiment for them. So we call them method in mind, or MIM. And then the above one, the alternative approach that I discussed, I will refer to it as SDM, for shared decision making. And essentially the shared decision making comes from the fact that you're eliciting a bunch of preferences and then matching those preferences to a ranking of methods, and then you're actually revealing that to the client. That's where, and we're trained people to do this in a kind of like a nice, friendly, and non-pushy way. So then essentially people both have a chance to say, okay, these people think this one is best for me based on their experience, but then also I can just say, no, next one, please. And then I can keep moving forward, right? So then what happens now, in either of all of these cases, eventually somebody chooses something. Like, very rarely people don't choose anything. If they don't choose any modern method, they might choose like a traditional method, or they might choose, they might just leave with condoms or whatever, but they choose something, right? Once they've chosen something, there's a tablet, there's a button on the tablet that we let the client push. And what happens then, Manisha, I see your hand. What happens then is that all of the prices for all the methods that are available to the client at this hospital are revealed at once. And the way that they're revealed is that kind of like the regular price is crossed out, and then the new price is like next to it. So sometimes it will actually just be, whatever, 5,000, 4,000, sometimes it will be 5,000, whatever. And we have 5 price levels for LARCs and 2 price levels for SARCs. These aren't cheap, so these are like, LARCs are about $8, $9. So we, in Cameroon, and then SARCs are about $2. So for the purposes of this talk, when I say LARC, it's a long-acting method. It's either the IUD, copper IUD, the LNG IUD, or the hormonal one doesn't exist in Cameroon. You may know it as Mirena in the United States. And the implant, which is usually Implanon or Nexplanon, so it's like 3 or 5 years duration. Whereas the short-acting methods are either the pill or the injectable, and both of these prices are for 3-month cycles of those methods. I can pause here, Manisha.
Berk, I just had a question here about the role of condoms, and what,
Yes.
because I noticed on the app that wasn't one of the choices.
Yeah.
And so I'm just curious about, STIs and HIV and condom use. So that was one question. And then the other question about the app was, is any of this, is there any sort of targeting of choice based on age, right? Because I'm thinking for the adolescents, at least, we often don't push IUDs. We're much more like, hey, do you want to take up the pill or an injectable, but we wouldn't jump straight to IUDs, for example. And so I was just wondering if, there was any sort of, based on kind of the age or even the sort of nulliparous status of the person coming in, if there was any targeting based on that.
Yeah, no, both great questions. So condoms are an interesting one because, as you know, so we're in Africa, so we're in an HIV setting. So that's extremely salient. So essentially dual protection is so important. And the typical use effectiveness of condoms is like so much lower than these methods that we're talking about, that essentially what the protocols do is that it's not actually in the 5 methods that are discussed in the IDM, right? In the beginning, like they do 4 plus the LAM, right? And then in the SDM, it wouldn't come up in the rankings until after you've exhausted everything else. But immediately after this price revelation, there's a whole section on dual protection. And that was mandatory for our study, like with all of our colleagues and IRB, et cetera. This is a big thing that they do. And they actually, at this hospital, believe it or not, it's rare for African hospitals, instead of condoms being in a jar and you can pick up as many as you want, they actually sell them to the clients. So for the study, what we said was that not only you're mandated to do the dual protection discussion, but you will give a packet of 20 condoms to each client, regardless of what else they adopted, for free, right? And so if at that point people do have questions about how to use a condom, etc., they do get them answered, but there isn't a specific, there is a cue card for condoms, obviously, but there isn't a kind of like an explicit counseling on condoms. So that's that. On the targeting of adolescents, there's two different issues. One of them is what you're asking about. And no, like actually we wanted to avoid this because our impression from having talked with OBGYNs both in the United States and in Cameroon is that even the nulliparity or adolescence is not necessarily an issue. It's more that like, have you had your sexual debut or not? And so if somebody is like 14, 15 and they haven't yet sex, then their OBGYN may say, hey, maybe the IUD is not for you. But I think if it's a 16-year-old person, like they're single, but they're sexually active, etc., we don't necessarily have a problem with it. So in that sense, the app doesn't look at nulliparous or adolescent people and say they are not eligible for a particular method. What we do in our adaptive experiment is that we've learned that like the kind of interventions that I'm discussing here have very heterogeneous effects for people like that versus others, so that the interventions they're now getting in our adaptive experiment are different. But that has nothing to do with us being conservative about talking about certain methods or not. It's more about they get different kinds of discounts and different kinds of counseling regime than other people. Does those answer your questions? Yeah, good. Natalie?
Yeah, I was just wondering about this kind of two-stage revelation of information where you've sort of already made your decision and then you see the prices. And I can imagine that I see something else is subsidized and now I want to go back and get that other thing. So I wondered if you could talk a bit about why you kind of decide to do this in these kind of two stages, given that probably price is an important part of the decision.
Yeah. So the reason is that we're essentially in this, not the econ world, but the family planning world where you're supposed to really make your decision unconditionally. Like, so you first pick the method that's best for you, and then we deal with the prices later. So then what happens then is that, Martha and I were discussing this earlier in our meeting, and you'll see in a second when I get to the findings, is that bunch of people will just leave with nothing. And that's a big group of people, so like they'll, even with a decent discount, people will leave with nothing. So we make a distinction in our language, even in our data. There's two variables. One is choosing something, and that happens after the counseling intervention is finished. And then there's adopting something, and that happens before you left the hospital. And those two things are not equal. And you're right that part of it depends on the price, and people can actually change their minds. What we do see often, though, that it's not so much that they see that something else is subsidized and they say, oh, I want to go back and listen to that now. That's rarer. But I think it's generally, if they like the method and they don't have enough money, they just leave without it, is the more common one. Now, there's an exception to this, which is that because we as economists were still offended by this two-step procedure, obviously, like you might have been. So we said, look, what if a client says, hey, how can I make a decision without knowing the price? Like, I want to know the price. So it's not easy. So we didn't make it the easiest to navigate to this price button, but it's not that hard. And every nurse knows how to do it. So if a client says, I want to know the prices before I decide, they just navigate to the price button and they push it. And then they know all the prices, and then now they can go back to counseling and whatever, and then she knows the vector of prices. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, maybe I have kind of a background question. What's the variation in price across these different methods? Are they all kind of similar, so it doesn't matter that much, or is like IUD way more expensive?
No, IUDs are way more expensive. So the IUDs are like, before our study, they were 5,250 francs at the hospital, which is about $9, compared with 1,500 francs or 1,250 for the injectable or the pill. And so that's about like 6 times, or no, sorry, the 3 to 4 times the upfront price. But of course, if you think about this from a not a credit constrained person perspective, but from a per month protection cost perspective, LARCs are way cheaper, right? So like they should be way more expensive than what they are, because they're going to protect you from 3 to 12 years. These things you have to renew, come and pay this price again every 3 months, right? So in a year, if you kept both of these, this would be more cost effective than that. And then actually to just segue into what I was going to say, which is that once the prices are revealed, the client is told that these prices are valid for her for 12 months after the counseling date, which means that they can adopt something today. Let's say actually they adopt something that wasn't subsidized, and then they don't like it 2 months later, they can come back and they can get the thing that was free because originally their price rate, we don't want people doing re-randomizations and things like that. So essentially, once you're in our system, you have your ID, and then for a year, like whatever you got initially is what you got. And then the final thing I want to say about prices before I go to the results is that it's not really fair to people. Suppose that there are some people who wouldn't have taken the long-acting method with the full price, but they take it when it's free, because they're really credit constrained. But then there's huge uncertainty about how this thing is going to work for you. Suppose the side effects are terrible and you want it out. The removals are equally expensive as the administration. So they're also 5,000 francs to just remove something. So in our study, we essentially made all removals free. And so you can come back 5 years later, and when it's getting removed, it's going to be free. All you have to do is like show your little card from the study. So essentially, we're subsidizing not only the administrations, but also the switchings and the removals and discontinuations. Again, because this was the pilot phase of a longer ongoing adaptive experiment, the statistical power in the pilot phase isn't big. So I'm going to essentially lump all of these discounts together and then show you discounted prices versus full prices when I talk about the price experiment. But you, Alexandra, I'll come to you in a second. But what I do want to say is that there is not a whole lot going on in this population with the short-acting methods. They're not that interested in them, even in the control group. And discounts for SARCs doesn't do anything for SARC adoption, which means there's no direct price elasticity. And discounts for LARCs doesn't do anything for SARC adoption. It doesn't switch people over. So there's no cross-price elasticity. So essentially, I'm going to ignore SARCs for the rest of the talk. That's not because we're obsessed with LARCs. It's just because on that margin, literally nothing is happening. So then it's actually nice for us in a way, because all the stuff that's happening is that some of the interventions are moving people who would have left the hospital with nothing, or with a method with like a 20+ percentage point failure rate, to something that has like no failure rate. As opposed to if a lot of our interventions were switching people from the injectable to the LARC, per person, we would be reducing their unintended pregnancy risk by like 5% rather than 20, 30%. So with that, let me go to Alexandra before we go to the findings.
Thank you. I was curious if you could say a little bit more about the group, the method in mind group that you mentioned. I noticed in the working paper online that there might have been a different algorithm based on the method that the client had in mind coming into the hospital. So actually, I was curious if you could.
Yeah, that's coming. Like I have a little flow, like that flow chart you're talking about probably.
Yeah,
right?
exactly.
Yeah, so that flow chart is the next slide, I think. So I'll just.
Perfect.
Yeah,
Thank you.
And then if that didn't answer your question, you can raise your hand again. Okay, so the data. So in the pilot phase, we don't have follow-up surveys. So we don't, the 12-month pregnancy rates are our final outcome, as I mentioned before, but we don't have those in the pilot, and we don't even have them yet for our adaptive experiment because the first person was like 8 months ago or something like that. So we have no data yet on pregnancies avoided, right? I do, however, have 4-month follow-up phone surveys that are being pretty successful and non-differential that suggest that discontinuations and switching are tiny. again, this is a different population than the US textbooks that you read, where like the discontinuations are on the order of 20-30% within a year. Those are married US couples of like certain age groups and things like that. So here with our study population, I will show you a figure that shows that switching is practically non-existent and discontinuations are very little percentage. So today I'll just show you like data on adoptions of contraceptives, specifically adoptions of LARCs, because like I said, there isn't any effect on SARCs. By the way, I do know that there's some kind of disagreement on like calling injectables and pills long-acting and short-acting. To me, they're short-acting mainly because I say two things. One is that they're not really set it and forget it. Because I forget it more than 3 months, then I risk getting pregnant. And then their typical use effectiveness rates are much closer to just kind of like the other traditional stuff than they are to LARCs. So as a result, just for semantic purposes, I call them SARCs. It's not really a term, but it works for us. Okay. Yeah, and then this is about, so the nice thing about focusing on adoptions is that because everything is from the tablet and the tablets are synced to the cloud every night, I have zero attrition in what I'm going to show you. So I don't have to worry about that. And then the regular things that we would have to worry about with follow-up surveys when we get to pregnancies and things. And the 3 primary outcomes are you either adopted a LARC, you adopted a SARC, or we call it you adopted nothing, but actually nothing includes condoms, lactational amenorrhea, traditional methods, everything else. And just for your information, people think that maybe we really reduced the scope of methods here compared to another setting, but we actually didn't. Literally in Cameroon, there's no patch, there's no ring. The sterilizations are de facto non-existent because you have to jump through a lot of hoops to get a sterilization, tubal ligation as a woman. So when we actually have these 5 methods, it is really those 5 methods that a clinic can sell. There is nothing else that they could sell. So we didn't intentionally make the kind of like the counseling so that it had 5, but of course it's very convenient for us, but it's the environment that we're working in. And there's if you're interested particularly in the adaptive trial and then how you write a pre-analysis plan for it, etc., please go to our AA registration, and then there's also clinicaltrials.gov registration. Okay, before we go to the findings, Shiva has a question.
Thank you so much.
Welcome.
Okay, I was wondering, do you have, are the women in your sample, had they previously ever been counseled about contraceptions, or have they previously used any of them? Did you have an idea of their history or familiarity with any of these?
Yeah. So you asked the question on the slide that I had the button of method mix. So
okay.
ignore columns 3 through 6, right? And focus on the first 2. So this is at the time of at the beginning of their intervention, this is what was happening. So we don't necessarily know whether they'd been counseled before or not, but we know that 87% of them were using nothing, right?
Okay.
And only 7% were using one of the 4 methods that we're kind of like working with here, and then another 5% there. But then when you say method in mind, which is more your question, right? You can see that, actually 43% had no method in mind. So we can maybe conservatively assume that those are people who really know nothing, right, about anything. But then, there was another 55% that had something in mind, and most of that is long-acting methods. And out of that, 3 out of 4 is implants. There's a reason for that. In a lot of other settings that I've been in, IUDs are more popular than the implant. And part of the reason might be that LNG IUDs are more popular than copper, so that could be one factor. But the other one is in Cameroon, there's been a lot of campaigns on implant, and they've given it a cute female name, Jadel. Everybody knows Jadel. So like when you ask people, what do you know about, they're like, oh, I know about Jadel, etc. So, and this shows up like in our data, most of the LARC adoptions are actually implants rather than IUDs. So anyway, so let's go back here and get to results. So now this is the question that was asked by Alexandra, was it? I think. So what happens is the following: a client enters the, clinic. They're asked whether they want to be counseled. If they say yes, we start going through the needs assessment. At some point, we discern that like they really don't know much about things, and then they're just there for counseling, or they are actually there with a specific method in mind. And some of these people are people who are actually using that method and they simply want to renew it. Some of them could also be that like they're actually not very happy with it and they want to discuss whether they can switch it out or not, right? So that's about the 55-45 split, right? If you don't know anything, it's pretty simple. Like we go through the entire like needs assessment, ask all these questions, and then you get randomized into IDM or STM. If you go to this way, you have a method in mind, 80% of those people have a LARC in mind. We don't bug them. So they go directly to the end, and then the LARC that they want is at the top of the list. And then if that fails, then they go to a default list. But actually at 20% of those people, they say they actually they have pill or the injectable in mind. So there, the script that the nurse follows is as follows. They say, look, it's great that you have the injectable in mind, but there may be methods that might be equally good, if not better for you. Would you be willing to listen to them if they come up? And the person can say, no, like my sister is like very happy with the injectable. I also want the injectable. They say that, they go here, they just get, just like the other ones, they go to the end of the counseling. We skip all the side effects and all the elicitation questions, and they just get most likely they get the method that they want and they leave. But that little polite nudge convinces 2/3 of them actually to say, yeah, I'll listen to other methods. And then we actually get them down here, and then they get randomized into one of the counseling bits. And then, we know from our data that a lot of them actually end up, adopting something that they didn't say they had in mind. So that's kind of like how this whole thing will work. So now I'll show the findings, which is easy because it's only one big graph, and then we'll talk off of that. Sorry. Right. So this is the main results. So on the horizontal axis, I have the 3 counseling regimes. So I have the people who had a method in mind, and then they didn't get diverted over here. And then I have the people who are randomized into either the individual decision-making, where each step they get to say what method they want to discuss, or into STM, where we reveal the rankings sequentially, and then we tell them this is the best for you, this is second best, third best, fourth best, right? And then the red bars are people who got full price, and the green bars are all of the discounts lumped together, right? So in the method in mind, unsurprisingly, because these are more motivated people, some of whom came to the hospital seeking a method, the adoption rates are the highest, but at full price, it's about 42%, and that goes up to 62% with some discounts, right? The interesting bit is here. So in the IDM, that, the full price adoptions drop to like close to 10%. It's like 11%. And then discounts raise it up to about 28.5%. It's still pretty big. Like you have a 250% increase in take up with discounts, right? But if you compare this red bar to this red bar, what you're doing is conditional on the price being full. Having a recommendation triples the likelihood that you're going to take a LARC, as opposed to having this kind of individual decision-making algorithm. Furthermore, the shared decision-making counseling makes you completely price insensitive, right? Further discounts do nothing to take up. And in the paper, we have a model of a utility maximizing client, they care about two things. They care about the price of the good, and they care about the perceived returns to the product. And this is quite clear that like a lot of people who don't know, who have no experience with these methods before, there's huge amount of uncertainty about whether this will work for you or not. So it seems as if the recommendation reduces the uncertainty so much, or increases rather your perceived returns from this method, that your willingness to pay goes up for these methods. And in our study, it looks like it goes up above the highest price in our study, so that telling people, oh, I will give it to you for like less than the higher price doesn't really do it. Okay. So now, before I go to a few caveats here, Darren has a question.
Just curious, why doesn't that model predict like an attenuated effect of the discounts in the method in mind group? Like there, I would think people come in with limited uncertainty about what they'd like to do, in which case it seems like they should also be price insensitive. And yet there, you're seeing like discounts have a big effect.
So it's interesting you asked that. Like Martha is doing a similar voucher experiment in the United States, and she sees exactly the same thing. Like she was telling me, and she can probably tell the story better. So correct me if I'm wrong, Martha, but people will make actually appointments to go get the IUD at a Planned Parenthood clinic in the United States. So you would think that they actually know exactly like what they're getting into. And then once they give their characteristics to the counselor, they will calculate how much they have to pay, if anything. And then she was telling me that about a third to like 40% of the people leave with nothing because they essentially, they're credit constrained. So so there's two parts to your question that so first, the method in mind people are two kinds of people. One group walked into the hospital seeking a specific method. They are, you're right, that likely less price sensitive. They're older, married, like a little richer, etc., and they know what they want. The second group with method in mind, they happen to be in the maternity clinic. They just given birth. And somebody asked them, hey, do you want to have counseling? They said, okay. And then when they got to the method in mind question, they said like, oh, I heard about this one. That one would be good. Right? So those people are generally much, much more credit constrained, and they didn't really walk into the hospital thinking, oh, I'm going to walk out today with a method. So we have a combination of those things, but then you're right that initially it did surprise me a little bit, but it's completely consistent with behavior where lots of people are leaving hospitals having kind of chosen, quote unquote, a method, but not adopting it due to a variety of reasons. It could be that they need to talk to their husbands or their parents if they're young. They need to go cobble together the money. They need to think about it a little bit more based on something that they heard, so on and so forth. Is that good, Darren?
Yeah, thanks.
Yeah, all right. Okay, so I want to now mention a few things that you might be thinking about. So one of the things you might say is that, well, look, this is like bunch of people, you told them that something is good for them and they walked out with it, but actually it wasn't really the best thing for them. Your algorithm is wrong. So you're going to have like a month later, this huge wave of discontinuations. And then so your impacts are going to shrink. Actually, our impacts are over time grow a little bit, essentially mainly because what's happening is that there are some discontinuations and switching, but they're minuscule. And they're actually in like net effect being overtaken by the fact that there are people who leave the hospital that day with nothing, but then they come back later. It could be tomorrow, it could be the next week, it could be a month to 2 months later. And because their prices are still valid, they've still been counseled, they still chose something, right? And they come back and say, hey, I'm ready to take this method. There are also people who are doing lactational amenorrhea for a few months and then they become ineligible when they stop breastfeeding exclusively. They might be coming back to get their methods as well. So over time, actually, this gap a little bit opens up, right? So when I show you these discontinuations and switching, just so you can see and you don't have to believe me, these green are the people who adopted a SARC. First of all, you can see that they're very little. They don't switch, and they're not really much discontinuations either. These kind of I don't know what color this is, but this reddish color is people who adopted LARCs. And you can see that that's growing over time. So they actually, the removals are this tiny sliver over here. That's very little, like a few percentage points. And then the percentage of people who are not using anything, or any of these four methods, is going down from about 60% to 50% over a period of 180 days. And we can do this because we have the data on the tablet. So we know actually people coming back, and then we can track that. We can have a daily panel of clients, so to speak, in our study. So that's number one. Number two, you might be worried that, well, look, your departure on this shared decision-making, despite the fact that it's based on this framework that's been recently proposed, is so radical that you have these people leaving without like proper informed choice. So we actually looked at how many methods do people discuss based on their counseling regime in great detail, right? So with the method in mind, it's natural. Like these people said, hey, I'm interested in this method, and then they go to the end and that method comes up, they discuss it, they take it or they don't take it, but that's it, right? They don't discuss much more methods. So it's about 90-something%. Interestingly, about 80% of the people here, sorry, again, but this computer is so glitchy. The 80% of IDM folks, more than 80%, discuss only one method and then they stop, right? Whereas less than 60% in the STM group, meaning that at least 40% discuss at least two methods, and more than 20% discuss at least three methods, right? So in a way, yes, these STM people didn't have that initial 60 to 90-second summary of each method, right? But when it comes to actually detailed discussion of a method, all of how it works, the duration, the side effects, the warning signs, and etc., they actually leave with like much more than the IDM people. And I don't have to mention, these are randomized groups, so these people are identical to each other. So it's not like the IDM people know more about stuff beforehand than the STM people. So this is truly due to a consequence of the intervention itself. And then the final thing is kind of like the realized rankings is that, yes, it is true that like because of our clientele, many of whom say, so for example, a third say, I want no more children, and another third say, I want to wait at least 3 years. And then only a remaining third say, I want to wait only between 1 and 3 years. And we've excluded the people who want to wait less than that from our study. Because of that, and because of the patterns of side effects that they're concerned about, long-acting methods do usually come on top, but it's not exclusively, right? So it is not because our intervention is pushing, regardless of what you say, LARCs aren't showing on top, right? There are lots of cases where the pill shows up on top, sometimes the pill is second, etc. And then the thing that we worried about, along with our family planning and public health colleagues, was that, yes, maybe people are taking a more effective method, maybe if it's even more suitable for them. But the experience of having this nurse telling them, I think this one is the best for you, is so annoying that there'll be some cost of kind of like trust in the health system or satisfaction or etc. So in our follow-up surveys, we have a 1-week follow-up survey. Immediately afterwards, we call these people, and then we do a quality checklist. And then we do also ask satisfaction questions and whether they would return to the hospital either for family planning services or other services. And I can tell you 2 things. I didn't add it to the slides here. One of them is that overall satisfaction rates and the quality checks are very high. And this is not surprising because I'm working, I mean, it's unfair. Like I can't compare it to levels in rural India, say, where you have thousands of clinics that you have to like standardize these things in. I have this one hospital that I'm doting over. And so of course, everything is going well there, but nonetheless, like overall satisfaction rates and the quality of service is pretty high, and it is not differential between treatment arms. So as far as we can tell, there isn't a trade-off between people adopting more effective methods, but at the cost of some feeling of like, loss of autonomy or like satisfaction or client welfare and so on and so forth. Okay. So I'm cognizant that it's now 1:15 your time. So the last 15 minutes is supposed to be Q&A. I only have some machine learning heterogeneity results that would take 2 minutes, but I can skip them if you want, and we can just go into Q&A. Or if you want to see them, I can just continue for another few minutes. I don't know what you think, Martha.
I'd love to see the machine learning results, Berk, but I understand if anyone else has a burning question, they may want to interject at this point too.
I'm not seeing any hands right now, so let's just quickly show them, and then.
And Natalie also votes for ML.
Okay, thank you, Natalie.
Yeah, oh, Manisha, there she goes too. Yeah, okay.
So this is my colleagues. Like, so yesterday when I was presenting, somebody said, "How is Susan Athey on this paper? Like, what, she doesn't do this kind of stuff." And I was essentially saying it's for this reason, and then she's also there. Her lab is helping with the whole adaptive experiment setup, like that I wouldn't be able to do by myself at all. But so what we've done essentially is that we've done these random forests where we're calculating, essentially estimating for each person a conditional average treatment effect. And then we're splitting them by above the median and below the median. So above the median, they're the relatively strongly affected group, and below the median, they're relatively weakly affected group. And actually, interestingly, in this pilot phase, we are able to identify these two groups that are actually quite different than each other. So the ATE actually overall in the study is about 0.16. I never really showed you that because you have to average over everything. And I showed you more granular stuff, but the average is about 0.15, 0.16, but the strong group, their average treatment effect is more like 27 percentage point increase. This is only due to the discounts. We just only use the counseling as heterogeneous, kind of like background characteristic. And then their contrast with a weak group that essentially aren't benefiting at all. And I don't know, Martha, if your question is about the group characteristics, which is coming up next, or is it something else?
It's just clarifying. Can you say you use a random forest model? So what are you, can you tell me what your, I guess, what are you trying to predict here? So what's being predicted? So
essentially,
effect,
like,
which treatment effect are you looking at?
So I definitely suggest, and other groups have done this already, like, you guys at some point invite Susan. She has a version of this presentation that totally focuses on like this other non-family planning stuff, so she can explain better. But my understanding is that essentially they have an algorithm where it kind of like divides the space by the background characteristics of the clients, right? So you're essentially saying, here are some adolescents, here are some adults. Among the adults, here are some people who just given birth and who haven't given yet birth, and so on and so forth. So it's like a tree, and the tree has like branches that are just going off. And then essentially what we do is like, we limit how many branches it can go, because we're not like, in Susan's experiments, usually they're with Google or Facebook, they have millions of like observation points, they're clicks essentially. In our case, we have like 1,000 people, so the tree can only go so far before the cells get really tiny. And then it's essentially saying, well, I'm going to go through a bunch of those, and I'm going to estimate what would the effect in each of those groups would have been. And I'm actually
right. So Berk,
I
think my question is even more basic.
Yeah,
so when you say a strong treatment effect, what does that mean? That means, because I'm thinking it's like the treatment effect is like taking up of a method, right? It's
correct.
A 0-1. So I guess, so you're trying to identify the group that are very likely to take up a certain type of method, or to switch their efficacy
yes.
from like what to what. That's what I'm just trying to get clarification on what you're predicting here.
I'm really sorry. I just jumped a step. So just like I showed you in the earlier, I always have to make this caveat. So now essentially, because I'm just showing you LARC take up, right?
Okay.
So essentially what we consider, so the treatment effect here is like, who is more responsive to discounts with respect to the likelihood of taking up a LARC? That's what, so sorry, that, so essentially this number you see here is essentially saying that if I go into this half of the study population that the machine learning algorithm identified as being strongly affected by getting a discount, compared to their control group, their take-up increases by 27 percentage points, as opposed to this weak group, which doesn't increase at all.
Okay.
Right, sorry.
Got
So
it.
I'm
Got it.
I'm sorry. Yeah. So and then the group characteristics of that are kind of like as you would expect. So the strongly affected group are way younger, right? They're more likely to be students. We actually have a whole bunch of university students in our sample, and you saw that like there was 42% university tertiary education. They have a lower number of children. A lot of them really want to wait a long period of time, and they showed up at the family planning unit. So these are kind of like, essentially, I consider these people as like, they're very motivated to avoid unwanted pregnancies in the next few years, but they might be credit constrained. So like discounts work really well for them. Whereas the weakly affected group are much older, they're much less likely to be students and so on and so forth. Right? So let me just conclude. Like I said before, I think of this as kind of like, yes, this potentially doesn't have a lot of external validity, but I do think that, you know, it's kind of like, think of how HIV used to be in sub-Saharan Africa. Like, it didn't used to be that every time you go into the clinic, you had to opt out of an HIV test. But after the pandemic hit, we've put that in the checklists and etc. And then we said, like, why don't you do this? I think of it a little bit like that. There are lots and lots of women who walk into a clinic or a pharmacy like every day. These things aren't hard to counsel or administer. Like, you know, lay people with like nurses, registered nurses can do it. Pharmacists potentially could do it. So this is a kind of low-hanging fruit where essentially what our experiment shows is that not only these people are open to receiving a free family planning counseling, but they're also quite responsive to either of our interventions. Like, they actually respond to discounts and they respond to our counseling approach. The second thing that I think is interesting here is that, you know, from a cost effectiveness perspective, I mean, our training is pretty simple and the app doesn't really add a whole lot. And in our setting, actually, everybody's using the app. So clearly, counseling people differently is way cheaper than giving a lot of discounts. And if these results were to hold up in like bigger trials, there's a lot to gain from potentially like taking this shared decision-making approach a little further rather than immediately going to kind of like, we're gonna give people discounts and etc., which are, you know, counseling intervention makes some people uncomfortable, but equally, some people are also uncomfortable with financial incentives for these things. So I think that, you know, and in a country like Cameroon, where the government is really unwilling to subsidize a lot of this stuff because they say, look, we can't make everything free. Some things we have to charge for, and this is one. We essentially didn't win that battle. And that's why we did this experiment. We said, will you at least allow us to show you that it would be cost effective for you to subsidize these things? And they said, okay, and that's how we have the experiment. But while we were doing that, while we can show, yes, in the status quo, the discounts would be good, if you actually move away from the status quo a little bit with your counseling intervention, then discounts are kind of a little bit more nuanced. And then in the adaptive experiment, what we're trying to do now is actually we're trying to see, can we intervene with different people differently? In other words, can we tailor the intervention to the client? And you can do that essentially because you have the app. So once the client says like, here is, I am 19 years old and I'm married and I do this, I do that, you know, the app can spit out essentially like, counsel her this way, give her this much discount, and so on and so forth. So essentially that's what the adaptive experiment is trying to figure out now. What are the optimal policies for different types of clients that are easily identifiable for the hospital and on which the clients cannot manipulate and cheat, like simple things like age or like recent delivery status and things like that. Let me stop there and then we can do some Q&A, and then we also have the pro seminar afterwards with graduate students and anybody else who wants to join. Martha. Oh, you're clapping. It's
I
not
was
your hand.
applauding for you, Berk. Yes.
Thank you, thank you. I thought you had a question. Graham.
Could you just talk a little bit about how you're thinking about setting up the adaptive trial? And I guess I'm wondering in particular, it seems like the insight from the comparison that you presented in this paper is that individually tailoring itself is what's driving this. And so are you going to, is the idea to look at different sequences that are more and less tailored? Because I sort of skimmed through the pre-analysis plan, which seemed to be about looking at each of the different possible options as what you're randomizing, but it seems like the procedure itself rather is what seems to be driving that.
Yeah, no, so that's a great thought. So no, our adaptive experiment is much simpler than what you're thinking of. Like essentially what we're saying is that, well, look, on average in the pilot, we saw these things, but they're average and we're really not sure. So what we want to do now is like, we want to take a reasonable tree and we want to treat the different branches of it slightly differently. And then because I'm in a setting where people are walking in every day, I can learn in January. Then based on that learning, I can adapt the assignment probabilities of these two interventions differently next month in February. And then I can keep doing that until May. And then once a winner for each subgroup has converged, then I move to the evaluation phase where I now prove that the winner is better than the status quo. And then so that I can show people a t-test essentially of like kind of like the winner versus the whatever. So that's the as complicated as that sounds, is like compared to what you're thinking, that's very simple. Like it's all about the interventions we're doing. There's a whole other bit where I'm actually, I'm afraid to say this because you will then start sending me PhD students immediately, is that there's a whole other bit of it where you want to actually use machine learning to exactly kind of like tweak the app itself, right? And then you can do adaptive experiments on that. And then there's so much in this app that you could actually do that. And actually, you're right that in some ways, tailoring the questions to the person is much more interesting than tailoring the discount to the person. Although from a, then you get into the black box AI issues that policymakers worry about. The stuff we're doing, I'm pretty confident that the hospital can adopt immediately afterwards. Whereas the other stuff is maybe more academic and for us, but there's a whole lot there like that I haven't even gotten into, but I've been thinking about, but I can't, I need like excited junior, like vibrant help, like with different skills than I have. So if you guys are thinking like, oh, here's a person who's great at this stuff and this would make a great paper or a great dissertation part or something, definitely kind of like put me in touch for sure.
Thanks.
And like I said, anybody wants to use this app either for clinical purposes or for study purposes, just let us know. I'm not saying it's anything special, but it's there, and it works. Anyone else? Well, oh, Becca.
Yes, I was just wondering, since this trial took place after COVID began, how you think the pandemic might have influenced the study setting or what you found, and if you expect any changes in a non-pandemic time?
The short answer is no. So I saw a lot of my colleagues and sadly a lot of graduate students have to pivot big time during the pandemic with field trials because everything that they're doing, like shutting down and things like that. The lucky thing about working in a hospital is that the hospitals don't close during the pandemic. And lucky thing about working in a women and children's hospital is that people don't stop having sex and having children and having obstetrics or gynecological needs. So this hospital essentially kept on ticking. All they did was like they had like those temperature guns at the door earlier on. And when the WHO, I have an event study kind of graph that shows the number of clients coming in each day for our counseling sessions. The day the WHO announced the pandemic officially, after that, there's a period where we have a 30% drop in the number of people coming in, but it quickly started rising back up and came back to levels that are pre-pandemic, like shortly after that. So I can't rule out that there is some selection, like the first question there was on kind of like what kinds of people are coming, but we haven't done that analysis because it's not particularly pertinent. I mean, we already have a select sample, so I'm not too worried about like what kinds of different people came. But what did shoot us badly was that there was a part of this research where we were going to go to high schools, universities, and youth centers in Yaoundé to campaign to get more adolescents and young people to the hospital to see if they react to these interventions in a similar way or differently, because it was all about preventing mostly adolescent unwanted pregnancies. And we weren't able to do that at all. So that's the bit that kind of fell by the wayside. But generally speaking, I don't think we've been affected all that much by the pandemic. And if we have been, I don't know about it. But it is, I mean, if you're really interested, just email me and then I'll stick one of my RAs onto it. We can just look at over time characteristics of the population. We have some data before the pandemic hit and obviously 2 years of data after. So we can compare kind of like the observable characteristics of the clients. Martha, did you want to bring it to a close now that it's 1:30 your time? Or?
I think that Esmeralda usually does
I see.
this,
Yeah.
but I may be falling down on my job. So so I guess this is a great time to let everyone go. Thank you so much for joining us. And Berk, I think that you're just going to stay on this link and transition over to the pro seminar after a short break. But thank you very much.
Correct. Thanks everyone for the great questions.